Hello, podcast listeners. You are now listening to the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. I'm your host, Jordan River, and I want to thank you for tuning in today. Before we get started, I urge you to share the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. Share the show, spread the show. It's how we grow. I do appreciate it. Today, I'm talking to a guest that I've been waiting for quite some time. So excited to speak to the board-certified lipidologist and my close personal friend, Dr. Kevin Chan is on the line today. How you doing, Dr. Chan?
I am great as usual. I'm so excited to hear your voice again.
I love it, man. Love doing podcasts with you, and really interested in all things fat, I'm going to be honest. So we're talking to a real certified lipidologist today, and that's what we're focusing on. We're focusing on fats, of course, how it ties into coffee, but just fat in general, fat in diet, fat in health, fat in wellness. So, Dr. Chan, why don't we start right from the top? When you're talking to people about fats, I'm sure you'd like to break it down and differentiate the types of fats. How do you recommend people approach fat in their diet?
Sure, that's very easy. I mean, I talk about this almost every day to my patient. It's pretty much there are two fats. You want good fats and you have bad fats, right? And in general, good fat are typically vegetable or plant-based fat, right? One of the best fat that I talk about all the time is avocado, for example,
Mm.
right? And there are also good fat coming from nuts, such as walnuts, right? So they have good fat, and I would say, hey, fat is good if you get from the right source. Now, on the other hand, typically it is the animal fat that may not be as good, right? So in medicine, we talk about typically the good fat is vegetable, plant-based, and then the animal fat, right? We use the term saturated fat, right? And animal
Mm.
fat is
Hmm.
not so good, right? Now, of course, there's the exception, right? The exception is, hey, no, I know, but what about fish? Fish is animal, right?
Right.
Well, yeah, but fish, it has a relatively different type of fat, right? They are the polyunsaturated omega-3 fatty acid in fish. So that's different, right? It's healthier versus the animal saturated fat, which typically is not as good. So, to make a long story short, I mean, we're not here to give a lecture on the different type of fat, right? And biochemistry, boring lecture. No, we simply talk about, hey, there are good fats and bad fats. And in general, we want more good versus bad. That's it.
Absolutely. And I think where you're coming from the plant base is important, but especially now so that I feel the quality and health quality of meats has been declining in this country, especially here in the United States for the listeners that you understand. If you're taking a look at a corn-fed piece of meat as opposed to a grass-fed one, I think that you'd probably be doing yourself a big service there. But like you said, it seems to be that the wild-caught fishes and then the plant-based nuts and avocados, which I think are technically a nut, seem to be the best sources of fat in general. Is that safe to say? Are there any other ones that
Yeah,
top your list?
no, yeah, absolutely. I would say that because, especially like you mentioned, the processed animal fat, right?
Yeah.
Including protein, right? Even though it's not the question, but simply processed meat, right? As I used to think that, oh, well, meat should be protein based, right? It must be healthier. But turns out that, in fact, processed meat, right, even though it's protein, actually increases your risk for diabetes.
Right.
And I did not know that, right, until I study more. So yes, you're right, not just fat, right, but even protein, if they're coming from processed meat, is simply not as good. So, I mean, I'm a big fan of high protein, high fat diet, but when I talk about protein and fat, I always refer to plant-based versus, right, or just animal protein or animal fat.
Right. And talk to me about, I would like to dive into dairy a little bit. And I know that not all dairy is created equally, especially the soft cheeses that we love here are the worst cheeses for you, the mozzarellas and the cheddars. And I know those are particularly horrible as opposed to you can at least get some good enzymes by some of the hard aged cheeses. But what are your thoughts on dairy and specifically cheese?
Sure. I mean, cheese, I mean, if you talk to any doctor who knows something about nutrition, they will say at least, right, cheese and dairy product is one of the highest source of saturated fat, right? So, right, and we know that depending on the type of saturated fat that we are talking about, right? I mean, there's an exception, of course, but we can talk about that talk about that later. But in general, right, saturated fat, coming from milk product, dairy product is also not as good because of the content of the saturated fat, which may negatively affect your bad cholesterol. Which again, I can go into more details. So my opinion is no, unless you are a cow, then I don't think we would benefit much from. I mean, right? And there's absolutely no problem to feed a baby cow milk if you are a cow. And if you're right, if you're humans, then I will prefer
Maybe it's
human
something
milk,
we'd limit.
right?
Okay, but we love it in
So
our
so
coffee. See, that's the problem is we love it in our coffee. So, but maybe it's something to limit, is what you're saying.
yeah, because again, in general, right, there's always exception, but in general, what we now know that at the very least, that milk that is coming from a non-human source, right, could generate inflammation, and inflammation is really the common
Right.
mechanism that will lead the form the basis of chronic diseases and also the aging process. So again, to answer your question, is dairy products, especially cheese, right? And because of the high saturated fat content,
Uh,
right, and the potential to generate inflammation,
you don't
to
like
me
that.
is it should be limited.
Makes sense. That does make sense. But what's maybe even more damaging is sometimes we think we're doing ourselves a favor by going with a milk substitute. I know that we're sticking to fats here, but that's another mistake people make with sugar substitutes. Oh, avoid sugar and then use this substitute. What do you think about these creamers and sugar substitute products? I haven't heard a
Yeah,
single doctor
again,
get behind them, but what's your opinion?
absolutely. No, same thing. Absolutely, right? In general, once again, right? I mean, sugar is, of course, right, has its own issue already, but substitute sugar is not much better because of the chemicals that they
Yeah.
contain, right? I mean, depending what type of chemicals that you're talking about, they can actually cause other type of endocrine or metabolic disorder that
Yep.
actually might go the other way. That in fact, right? I'm not going to go into details, but we know some of these sugar substitutes actually will promote weight gain after a while,
That's
right?
exactly
So
right. Yeah.
yeah,
Aspartame came up
and
on this show, even neurological disorders coming from some of these. That's, I mean, come on. Sugar's
exactly,
bad, but a
exactly.
neurological disorder, that's wow.
So if so, I would rather say like, hey, either will limit sugar,
Yeah.
or but if you have to, then I will rather you take sugar in moderate consumption than trying to get substitutes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same with those creamers, right? Like the powdered creamers, those are no good for you, are they?
Again, depending on the chemical constituents of
Right.
those chemicals, but I would say that in general, right, I mean, yeah, they're
They're
simply
all
not as
processed. Yeah.
healthy.
Yep.
So
So yeah, that's troublesome for sure. I want to get your opinion on something. You know, a lot of people who are big coffee fans who understand the health benefits of coffee. A lot of these people employ a high fat diet. Some of them even into a state of ketosis. What's your opinion
mhm.
on this ketogenic diet? A lot of people having success with it. A lot of doctors saying, "Hey, we don't know the effects yet because there haven't been studies." What's your opinion?
Absolutely, because I mean, this is what I say to my patient, and I think I alluded to it briefly last time. Now, with last discussion is, in general, right? When a patient come to me and say, "May I use ketogenic diet for weight loss?" and I'll say, "Yeah, I think I have seen enough data to show
Hmm.
that ketogenic diet could promote a weight loss." The
Hmm.
question remains still: is it going to be healthy weight loss? Is
Ah.
this a health, right? So I don't think there are enough study yet to justify that ketogenic diet, if used chronically, is a healthy diet, right? Certainly it can lose weight, and certainly it is okay for some people, especially those subsets of the population who, like I told you last time, who may have underlying seizure disorder or epilepsy. Those patients may preferentially benefit from a more ketogenic type of diet. But can I say that for everyone? Should everybody be on keto diet? That depends, right? It really depends on how the patient responds. Because
Hmm.
remember that in my practice, right, we talk about population health, blah blah blah. But remember, every patient in front of me is a n equal to one, right? It's
Hmm.
always that one patient in front of me that
Yes.
I have to be responsible for. And then I will always tell the patient that, hey, ketogenic diet probably will help you lose weight, but is it healthy for you? Depends on your your individual biochemical makeup, and we have to do labs, right? I mean, we really have to break down how the ketogenic metabolic process is affecting the way you metabolize your cholesterol and your lipid, which becomes my specialty, because that breakdown on how the LDL, right, break down into different particle number or different particle size. That really is the key to, and also inflammation is what will lead to future heart disease. So we really have to individualize. I cannot just say, hey, ketogenic diet for everyone.
Right.
Maybe for weight loss, but for long-term dietary substitutes, I don't know.
I'm so glad that you said that because it's so true. You hear these people who have some people have so much success and they love it. Other people try a diet and it makes them feel like crap. Well, no wonder. It's because, like you said, humans are organic beings. They are completely unique in their biochemistry and the way that they react to anything, and the diet is no different. So I'm really glad that you
Yeah,
brought that
in
up.
general, right? We don't want to. I mean, again, as much as we rely on research data from the population standpoint, but we have to really take into account individuality, right? It's not just one size fit all,
You're so right. I'm really
right?
glad you brought that up.
Yeah, can I make everybody wear 9.5 size shoes? I mean, I wear 9.5. Can I say, okay, 9.5 is good for you because it's good for me. So everybody should wear 9.5. Come
No,
on,
that's exactly right.
right?
Everyone will be walking around uncomfortable. That's not how we do it, man. That's exactly right. Now, you brought up LDL. I got to dig into this cholesterol conversation. Talk to me about good cholesterol,
Absolutely.
bad cholesterol. I see some people doing this high fat diet or a carnivore diet, and it's leveling out their cholesterol. It just seems insane. Tell me the truth
It can
behind good
be.
and bad cholesterol.
Yeah, in my practice, right, I have seen both. And sometimes, like I have seen patient with increased LDL, which is the so-called bad cholesterol, and I have seen patient with actually lower LDL, right? It may have to do with depending on when I catch them, right, in
Ah,
terms of their diet. The general understanding is this, right? When you subscribe yourself to a more ketogenic type of diet, right, you may experience a transient increase of LDL, which then may level off as time goes on. But the
oh,
question is, not everyone is going to level off
oh
their
wow.
LDL, right, in the same in equal manner. And what is more important, remember, if you remember nothing else from me, is just remember the LDL is simply a very elementary way of looking at your bad cholesterol. Right? To really makes more sense out of LDL, you've got to ask your doctor, ideally, to look to the LDL particle number and their particle size. Right?
Oh.
It's not just the amount of LDL. Right? I would love to explain that maybe in the future. But at the very least, right? LDL is simply a global impression of your bad
Oh, wow. That
cholesterol.
doesn't even
But
tell you the total. It's more of like a ratio type reading as opposed to a total particle number and
y-
size of the particles?
yes and no. The LDL is simply a measured, calculated concentration. To really know your LDL amount, you've got to look into the LDL particle number
Whoa.
and even the size, right? And not only that, LDL themselves could be okay. But when LDL under certain circumstances, they can become oxidized. And when they're oxidized, they become inflamed. So once again, right, people will argue with me that, hey, not every patient with high LDL could have heart disease. And I say, absolutely. It is patients with LDL that are oxidized, which then becomes
Whoa.
inflamed. And then remember, it is bad cholesterol, especially LDL with small size and high number. Just imagine, right? Hopefully, I'm not confusing people here, but
No, no,
just
this is
look at the
wonderful.
LDL between a basketball and a marble.
Right.
Basketball size of LDL is generally safer than a marble size of LDL. So when you have one or two LDL particle, but they're big,
Right.
they're generally safer. They're less likely to become oxidized and inflamed. But when you have very tiny, numerous marbles of LDL particles, they're much more likely to become oxidized and inflamed and then clog up the arteries, right?
Right.
Maybe that's how one way you can see that. And those are much more dangerous. So always remember, when the LDL is small, size, and numerous in particle number, right? And then when they're inflamed,
Whoa.
that's the cause for heart disease.
That makes
So
so
it's a
much sense.
lot, yeah, and it's way deeper than just your LDL number. It's a screening, my friend. It's just a screening, right? So it's way deeper than that. And
Okay.
I think it's not we're not doing patient enough justice if we simply just focus on the LDL, concentration number.
You're totally blowing our mind. And going back to our mutual friend, Dr. Stephen Hellshine, Dr. Coffee, he was talking about this exact process and the damage on the heart walls becoming kind of like Velcro and how it sticks. And kind of like how you were saying, how many people who have very severe plaque buildup don't have events. It doesn't have to do with that one-to-one. My question to you is, you talk about this particle size with the LDL. Is that determined genetically? Is that determined by lifestyle choices? Both? Like, what determines the size of the particles?
Good, good. Depending on the type of cholesterol particle that we are talking about, if you're referring to LDL, of course it has a genetic component to it. But as you now know, right nowadays with the study of epigenetics,
Ah,
we now know that you are not destined, by your genes alone, right? Genes play a role, right? And different expert may assign a different percentage, right? Roughly 30, 40% may
sure.
be genetically driven, but the rest of it is really driven by your environment that you subject your genes under, right? So it's your lifestyle that is really making a big difference. So for example, right, one thing that after I talk about this, right, is hey, if you engage yourself in a very inflammatory diet
Ah,
or in a very high refined carbohydrate diet,
mm,
right, then it tends to drive up, right, the triglyceride in your lipids and tends to make the LDL smaller
whoa.
and more numerous. So when patient asks me, oh, Dr. Chan, what can I do to make my LDL, you know, not as small and not as numerous? And I would say the first thing you've got to do is to watch your refined carbohydrate
Whoa.
content because that is going to drive your LDL into smaller marbles and more numerous and therefore more likely to be oxidized, inflamed, and causing heart disease.
That makes
Got it?
so much sense. And especially because we have such a heart disease problem out here, and that's our diet. That's what our diet consists of. I assume it's all of those things that are bad for our hearts, oils, smoking. Does it probably all that stuff does it?
Yes, absolutely. That's
Yeah.
called their big time inflammatory driver.
Right. Right. Wow, that's really enlightening. Quite
Now,
enlightening.
let me ask you this. I mean, if with your permission, I would love to give an analogy to your audience,
Please.
and that would
Absolutely.
yeah. Okay. Now, and let me give credit. This analogy is actually given by my friend, a cardiothoracic surgeon. So I would give him credit to explain to patient that look. I mean, he talks about the LDL like the passengers, right? The number of passenger, right, that we have. But what we don't talk about is the vehicle, right? Do you
Mm,
carry so for example, you have two groups of people, right? Let's talk about 10 people, okay? 10 passengers in two different group.
mhm.
The first group of 10 passenger, each one of them is riding in a motorcycle. Let's say a motorcycle.
Sure.
So, right, so then you have 10 passengers, but each passenger is riding on one
Individual
motorcycle.
motorcycle. Right.
So how many motorcycles do you have? 10, right?
Uh huh.
Okay. Now, on the other hand, you have the same 10 passengers, but they all ride in one bus.
Right.
It's one bus. So here's the analogy. When we measure the LDL concentration, we're only telling patient that we have 10 passengers.
Whoa.
But we do not talk about whether or not that 10 passengers are they riding on an individual motorbike or are they riding on a big bus? Because when they're riding on an individual, smaller, single bike, and that's dangerous, right? Those are what I called earlier the
Totally.
marbles.
You're waiting for a
They are
pile up.
smaller.
What happens
Right?
when you come
Thank
to a
you.
pothole? The van just needs to drive around the pothole. The 10 motorcycles, they all got to, there's going to be a pile up. I totally get the analogy. I
So
love
you
it.
ask the doctor, right? Hey, did you tell me about? I mean, I know my passengers. I have 10 passengers, but can you tell me about my vehicle? the vehicle that carry the passengers, and few doctors ever talk about that.
Wow.
But those are hugely important, because when you have individual smaller bike, right, they are the one that will drive heart disease versus a big busload, right? Even though the passengers are the same number. I hope that is clear.
This is extremely clear. This was totally eye-opening. Unfortunately, we have to cut this interview short. We need to have you back again, Dr. Chan, because we're just getting started. We're just scratching the surface. But first, why don't you shout out everything that you're working with? Pineapple Health, just anything you want to share with the audience.
Remember, Pineapple Health stands for everything anti-inflammatory. Done.
I love it. Thank you so much, everybody listening. Thank you. This is Dr. Kevin Chan and Jordan River signing off, wishing you an extraordinary day. We'll see you next time on the Coffee, Health, and Science Podcast.